when we're thinking about like what role does this tech provide into organizing or just general electoral politics, ask the question like, can this get me votes? If you can't answer that in like one sentence, why have you built this thing? You need to have a very good answer for like the purpose that your tech is providing to the operation. And if it's to be a force multiplier for your organizers to make them more efficient, great. If it's to provide new mechanisms for them to do the work that they already know that they need to do, but they're understaffed and under-resourced and tech can fill that void, great. If it's flashy and might get you a headline in Axios, maybe not the best use of time.
Yeah, I'd like to chime in on this because I agree with both Tess and Matt. And speaking of this idea of force multiplier, a thing I like to say is technology should be invisible. It should not be a barrier, right? You should hire people who are good at organizing. You should hire people who are good at targeting, not people who know how to use Excel, not people who know how to use a piece of software, right? All too often, these technologies become, if you will, fetish objects unto themselves, which then serve as barriers to entry and participation for people who don't have access to learn standard tooling, but could probably do a much better job because they understand the problem and the people than the people who do learn how to use the technology.
I'll just double down a little bit on what Matt was saying about making sure that the technology has a real purpose that's doing real good for the campaign or organization. It feels like over and over again, we see technologists and sometimes organizers gravitating toward the latest flashy thing. It's the, the sort of, oh, look, it's a squirrel type of thing. Right now, I'm afraid it might be NFTs and crypto. Maybe there's some viable purpose for campaigns. I don't think anybody's figured that out yet. So I'd much rather see people focus on technology investments that actually get the job done.
Great. Thank you all for sharing those thoughts. So we've talked a little bit about how we want our technology to be invisible. We also want it to be enabling. I'll think about some of my experience on campaigns when the dialer kept going down, the technology was no longer invisible, and it was a nightmare that no one wanted to deal with. So I think we're trying to have dialers and technology that don't go down. But Dheeraj, can you talk to me a little bit about what technology you're most excited about right now?
There's no one thing per se that I'm excited about, but what I am excited about is a trend or an occurrence, which is as recently as 5 or 10 years ago, there were computations that required that you buy software as a service or server time to do. And these are for things as simple as like figuring out which voters in your congressional district you want to be talking to. Things have come so far along now that you can do redistricting work on an iPad if you really wanted to. And I proved the point by writing redistricting software for an iPad, right? This is, in my mind, an incredibly important development. You don't need to be paying people to do work for you. You don't need to be buying software. You don't need to be buying tech per se. You can do things with skills on your own and be your own sort of guerrilla political organizer. And I think that's awesome. And if you want to learn how, by all means, I'm happy to help.
Josh, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, generally speaking, I'm a big fan of technologies that are purpose-built to accomplish a specific task. So too often we see campaigns and organizations using consumer technologies or technologies that were created for corporate marketing purposes and sort of repurposing those and making them work for their purposes, which comes out in a sort of a clunky way sometimes. So to illustrate that point a little bit, can folks raise their hand if they've ever opened a beer bottle with something other than a bottle opener? Anybody? Almost everybody. What'd you use to do that? A lighter? Countertop? Any butter knife action? Anybody? No? Often when we try to do those things, we can sometimes get it to work, but it's often pretty far from ideal. Can be messy, might be dangerous if you use your teeth in that case. So a couple examples of those that come to mind for me. One is using machine learning for targeting emails to our donors, potential donors, supporters. So there are some marketing tools that do that, mostly for corporate purposes. As far as I know, nobody's got anything built like that specifically for political campaigns or for nonprofits. One of my companies, the Juggernaut Project, is working on something along those lines. It's early stages, so I don't want to share much. Another Technology that excites me along those lines, a project I'm working on called Civic Shout. We're building a purpose-built email and SMS acquisition platform, and it's made specifically for that. So unlike other ad platforms, you don't have to sort of come up with some clunky workaround to get it to work. One more I'll mention real quick. A new company called Give Blue is about to launch a product called Eventfully, I believe next week. That's a virtual event platform for campaigns. So, anybody that's hosted a virtual campaign event over the past couple of years or previously tried to use Zoom or Google Meet, you can get it to work, but not particularly well, usually for your purposes. So Give Blue is built exactly for that purpose.
I'm most excited about the trend on the where and how our tech is being built. The commodification of political tech, in my opinion, is a very good step forward. And how much that has accelerated in the past 4 to 5 years has been very encouraging. To give an example, going back to 2016, the Clinton campaign for volunteer events or event signups, the entire application, the entire web app was built in-house. It was built by a team of software engineers. It was hosted. It was okay. But it was incredibly difficult. It was very, very hard to build that application. And because presidential campaigns are actually a really bad place to build software because you're understaffed, you're under-resourced, and you're under duress, you build what you can as quickly as you can. Flash forward to 2018 and 2020. How many people here have ever used Mobilize to sign up for an event? Awesome tool. Like I called the founders of Mobilize and said, thank you for building this so we never have to do this ever again. And it's kind of like this great success story of this space. Like, it's a very valuable tool. So the fact that where our tech is being built is being extracted out of these ephemeral organizations that necessarily have an end date where the people and the infrastructure and the knowledge goes away after election day, and moving that into these long-lasting, enduring organizations is like only making our tech better.
And the thing that I'll add is, speaking back to Dheeraj's point about accessibility, I think like making these tools and the tech more accessible to organizations who are not big campaigns that have lots of expendable income and resources, I think is really key to be able, because we know that the most effective work is happening at the local level, right? It's happening in grassroots organizations, grassroots movements. And so being able to get these tools in the hands of those folks who know their communities best, I think is super key. And I think we're starting to see more ways in which that is coming accessible, which I think is really exciting. And then being able to then do also like knowledge sharing of the skills that it takes to then utilize these tools, utilize the data sets to the best of their ability. I think that's something that I'd love to see happen more in Texas, instead of us having to like import, talent from other places or people who have those skills going elsewhere. Staying in Texas and doing the work here and being able to share those skills with others in the movement, I think is something that I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, absolutely. And definitely very excited about trying to keep that talent in Texas as we look to turn Texas blue in the next couple of cycles, and excited to see so many local Texas activists here today. Moving on a little bit, Matt, I know you spend a lot of time thinking about the expanding tech ecosystem in the political space. What technology or technologies would you say are prominent but not yet meeting our expectations?
So we've had a few panels today talk about how amazing relational organizing is. And we've had a few cycles where we can test out that, gather data. We have a lot of findings showing us that relational organizing does work. But the retrospective around our relational organizing tools over the past 2.5, 3 cycles has been, how do we scale it? How can we take these? We know that this sample group of the population that was relational organized outperformed by whatever percent. That's a different panel to tell you what percent that was. But we know that happens. And when we talk about scaling and we talk about relational organizing, I think in most people's brains who have either used these tools or maybe even built these tools, you're probably picturing some sort of app that lets you text people. And I don't know about all of you, but I don't use texting that much. People use things like WhatsApp, or Discord is a really big medium, or they're in Twitter DMs. I use Signal because I'm paranoid. And it's the people who text me are my dentist. And if you're trying to do some relational organizing with me, and we always talk on Slack, but then suddenly you're sending me a text, it doesn't feel natural. It doesn't feel genuine. It kind of is defeating the purpose of the relational organizing, because you've extracted our relationship out of this interaction and you're sending me something. So what I love people who are building tech or thinking about the tech that's being built or buying the tech is start approaching this idea of relational organizing outside the context of just texting. And for that matter, if you're thinking about building some political tech, we have a lot of texting apps now. We don't need that many more. So think about, what are the unsolved problems with relational organizing? Maybe you can't hook into Discord the way you can hook into SMS. Maybe the APIs aren't there. So what tool can you build that finds another way to empower people to organize in Discord? Maybe it's something that more closely resembles call time tools. Maybe it's something that we've never tried before, but we lean into these APIs, mostly email and SMS, because the APIs exist and they're easier to integrate with, and the data modeling is a little bit easier than like trying to match against apeface 69 in a Discord server. Like, it's too hard, but we're missing a large population of people here, and expanding what we think of relational organizing into these other platforms will require some technical development to get us there.
Thank you for that. Tess, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think to your point, and I think a point that was made earlier about like utilizing tools or having tools that are made specifically for a particular type of task that you're trying to accomplish. I think there's been attempts for people to use CRMs as sort of the source of truth for their organization, where they it's a one-stop shop where they can go in, log in, and be able to do everything. Make calls, send texts, send emails. But the problem is when you have a tool that's trying to generalize like that, it's not like very good at any of the things. You can log in and you can do the things, but it's not going to do them particularly well. And so I think like moving away from trying to find that unicorn, that like one-stop shop tool, and utilizing these tools that are really good at that task, like a really good dialer or a really good relational organizing tool, and adding like functionality to be able to better integrate those tools with each other. At TMC, we have Parsons, which is an open source Python package, which we're able to use in order to create sync outs from one tool to another, so that you can have folks who've replied in your hustle, or who have like filled out pledge to vote cards, maybe in like some other sort of app, end up in your CRM, so that you can then contact those folks later. And it's building those types of like integrations, I think, where things need to move, so that you're, again, not settling for something like, oh, great, you only have one login. That's great. But it's not actually doing all the things that you want it to do, because people have, the organizing work is happening in so many niche communities, right? And there are different needs, and no big tool is going to be able to anticipate all of those needs for you to be able to do everything that you want to do. And so I think, building those integrations and adding features that allow people to go where the work is happening, I think, back to Matt's point.
Absolutely.
This idea of relational organizing, and I'd really like to pick out something and make explicit what was implicit in what Matt and Tess said, which is I'm actually old enough that I remember when we just called it organizing, right? And I am from Houston, Texas, and prior to that, Queens, New York, which is the Houston of the Northeast, right? So, I'm also old enough to remember when this was embedded in a specific cultural context, which is what we call relational organizing now was what Black and Latin people did in Queens my whole life, right? And this is how they related to each other. There were phone books. Aunties called each other. Cousins called each other, right? This was just what it was. And when you try to take something like that, abstract it away from its original cultural context, and put it into an artificial environment where people are no longer interacting with each other the way they would, right? Like by, say, calling each other or meeting at a church function and talking, right? You get outcomes like what Matt described, which is we talk on Slack, but you get a text, right? It undercuts the entire power of the whole thing. And I think this is what happens when we sort of try to artificially technologize organic processes. So there's a hand grenade.
Moving on to our next question. It's always tempting to escalate our uses of technology because the other side is doing it. How do we figure out the line between ethical, empowering uses of technology versus times when the harm from a technology is greater than the benefit? Josh, could you comment a little bit on this?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's tough because when, on the one hand, when you're on a campaign, you want to do whatever you can to win, right? That's why you're there. And you pour your blood, sweat, and tears into that. So it's tough to cross those lines and sometimes figure out where those lines are. On the other hand, I don't think any of us wants to be in a race to the bottom in terms of ethics with Republicans who tend to be challenged on those issues from time to time. I find it really helpful to just try to keep our core values as Democrats and progressives in mind as we're making tactical decisions in our work, as we're thinking about which tools and technologies to use. So as Democrats or as progressives, we treat people with dignity. It's part of who we are. It's why we're in this work. We care about people's privacy. So to use a couple examples from the email world where I do most of my work, you can buy a CSV of donor email addresses, send them spam them with an unsolicited email with a wildly deceptive email claiming a 10 times donation match, claiming that the world's going to end if you don't donate in 30 seconds, and then you trick them into a recurring donation they didn't realize they were signing up for. You can raise money that way. Ultimately, it fundamentally conflicts with our values and why we got into this work in the first place. So I think if you think about your values, look at it through that lens, it's usually pretty clear what's going to be right and wrong. And frankly, I'll throw a grenade as well into the mix. That's why it's so disappointing to me that some of the most prominent politicians and entities in the Democratic Party treat supporters extremely poorly on email and SMS. They spam them, they scam them. That's the entire model. So it's, Nancy Pelosi does it, the DCCC does it, and it reflects poorly on all of us and harms the entire ecosystem.
Yeah, I think we've all gotten those multiple page texts that you have to just sort of keep scrolling and you're like, is this actually a text message or an email or what is this?
We just need to be aware of the biases in the systems, I guess is the easiest way to say it. But it's the hardest thing to work on, especially when the people who are building the systems are not representative of the people who will be on the receiving end of the systems. This comes back to a lot of our issues more broadly in the ecosystem of either career pathing or talent retention, but it's particularly visible in technology, whether you're talking about progressive or political tech or just tech in general. We have so much work to do to be representative here. And it's very easy to have a table full of people who look like me building a system completely either oblivious or just not prioritizing the problems that it can create. And so whether that is something around being respectful on like how we interact with our constituents, whether it's just general data privacy, whether it's thinking about who does this harm in the process, we have to start getting better at that. And that happens with better representation of who's building the tools, who's at the table making decisions. I think you were framing the question somewhere around like, well, if the other side's doing it, where do we draw our lines? I mean, my priors here are that like they don't care so much about these things, and I would like to hope we at least say that we do, and we can start putting the resources behind what we say we prioritize, and that's by building out these more diverse teams of people who are building our technology. And that starts with a financial investment. It starts with mentorship. It starts with career pathing. One
specific example I can think of is specifically with like the trans non-binary community with like dead naming that happens when you're texting straight from the voter file, and like that's actively harmful to those folks. And that, like, as somebody who also like identifies as non-binary, I think it's like something that I think about often of like, how are people making the effort to update those records so that the next time that you're reaching out to those folks, you're not actively causing harm to the community. And I think, like, as Matt was kind of saying earlier, you know, the more that we have folks from those communities helping to build the tech, the more we can make sure that there is the ability in these tools to make those changes, so that we're doing better and that we're being able to really live by some of those like principles that we say that we have.
I did finally think of something, which is that all too often people who receive these messages or communications from politicians or from campaigns or from institutions or entities are essentially being asked to become resources, right? Like, give me your hours, give me your things, or give me your time, or some combination thereof. There are very few entities out there or very few actors out there treating the recipients of communication as ends unto themselves, right? Like, for example, as AOC does in New York, like she set up a homework help program, right? And this is an incredibly important thing to do, right? Like, not only does it treat voters with respect and people with respect, but it shows them tangibly that they matter rather than they are a thing to be tapped by you. And I think it's a thing that we could probably all be better at.
Go for it.
That's a really good point. And too many campaigns treat, you know, voters, donors, supporters as an ATM. And they think that the only thing they're good for is giving money. I love the AOC example. Definitely, you know, one of my favorite email programs, one of my favorite SMS programs. Another thing they did with the SMS program, when there was flooding in New York, they sent a text message to constituents that said, "Do you need help? Here are resources. We will help you." And as I understand it, they were actually responsive when folks texted back and said they needed help.
That's great. And I think we saw, I know we saw a number of Texas politicians, especially as the COVID vaccines were coming out, trying to schedule people for appointments and doing some of that outreach work. But I think really trying to meet the communities where they are is important, and not just thinking about all of our folks' resources or, you know, ATM machines. Well, I'm going to take a quick pause here. I've got a couple more questions for this group, but before I do that, I want to see if the audience has any questions, because I want to make sure that we have time for your questions. So I'll take a couple questions from the audience. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm curious. You guys are familiar, I assume, with the RNC's I-360 voter central database. Why can't we have one? That's all. I just need to know that. And can we get it built before September? Second question.
Go for it, Matt.
We'll let you speak first.
Lauren, I think you might actually have some good things to say here as well. But the Democratic Party is not a top-down apparatus, as we know, whereas the Republican Party is much better at being top-down. And what that has created in this very decentralized model is incentives to create assets among various pieces of the Democratic Party. And one of those assets is the state voter file. And the 50 state parties have a very strong incentive to protect that asset. And because we have not come up with any agreed upon mechanism to centralize that data or to share it at terms that ever seem to make anybody happy, we're kind of fractured across 50 plus 4 organizations on the committee side. And then anything that's on the vendor or the IE side, it's kind of a different Wild West over there. We do have some institutions in place that are attempting to make this better. You may be familiar with the Democratic Data Exchange. The Democratic Data Exchange is trying to create a compliant bridge between the hard side, which is FEC regulated organizations, and the soft side, which is the independent expenditures and all these other types of organizations that can raise and spend a lot more money. Go back to that. The Democratic Data Exchange is trying to do this in a compliant way. I'm not convinced that the Republicans are doing this in a compliant way. It seems that they are kind of just like, well, the FEC is toothless and we don't care. But actually, Lauren, since you were the CTO of the Texas Democrats, you could probably say a lot more about state parties and the voter file there.
Yeah, I might actually step out of my moderator role and jump into the answer of this question. So as Matt kind of talked about, every state kind of manages their voter file. And I think one of the most important things about the voter file is to think about with regards to this question, but also the voter file, is there are some great institutions that exist within the Democratic Party to do this correctly. Folks using VAN and using the state voter file, and then the DNC has done a lot of incredible work in the back end to make us a database that kind of keeps this. Those things are all getting us to exactly kind of where you described going. I think a challenge in recent years, there've been a couple of big challenges in recent years. One, I think there's been a lot of technology that has looked to sort of actively work outside the voter file because the voter file hasn't been updated. But there's this kind of concept of junk in, junk out, and good data in, good data out. And something we focused a lot on in Texas is trying to make the access to the voter file easier and cheaper and more affordable for folks, because the more people at every level we can get using the same voter file, the better the data is going to be and sort of the closer we get to this vision. And so that is sort of a goal. And I was very proud in Texas that we were able to make it's still not free, but we were able to make VAN a lot more affordable for a lot of the sort of lower level campaigns, and got feedback from a lot of other states and some national organizations that we had sort of done that in an effective way so that people could be sort of working off of the same voter file. I think sort of in that we see copies of the voter file being made by organizations, which is sort of actively unhelpful for this role of all working off the same voter file. I lived in New York for about 10 years. Through my work at the state party, I've known the last 3 data directors in New York personally. The current data director in New York used to work for me in Texas. Love them all. I know for a fact I've been removed from VAN many, many times in New York. I also still get text messages from people in New York, and I know those organizations have their own copy of the voter file from when I lived there 4 years ago. And so I think there's a lot that we can also continue to do to kind of work together to work off the same database and kind of have some better data going in. And if you're interested, I had a very long Twitter thread on this a couple of months ago that I encourage you to go look at too, where a lot of people shared their thoughts kind of from around the state and around the country. But I think it's something we're working towards, but it's not perfect for a lot of reasons.
I would like to say something about this, which is part of it is, as Matt said, talent retention, right? Like building something like i360 is not the kind of thing that just happens quickly. It's not like throwing up a WordPress blog, right? If you're old enough, you'll remember when people said about Ruby, you can make a blog in 5 minutes, right? Something like i360 takes a whole lot of time to build, and it takes a whole lot of people working with a lot of resources. And part of our federated, decentralized structure on our side of things makes it very hard to get that concentrated, focused effort of money, and also people able to work on something for that long, right? I think that we're not going to have a solution to this anytime soon until we solve, 1, the retention problem, and 2, the investment problem, right?
Do you think there's a deficiency of understanding this thing that it helps that they win a lot of really competitive races based on this program that they have, because it has been perfected over time, right? And in 16, for example, the Trump campaign was wiped. I mean, it was basically nothing. It's a shell operation. But they still won because the RNC was there with one database, all the voters, and they ran field for basically the Trump campaign, right? So, like, to me, I guess I'm asking, is there someone to make the case too, if people understood, if we fixed this thing, it would have the impact of 1,000 comments, right? Like, is it just a matter of people not being able to understand? Like, they have their door knockers go with iPads, and they're adding data like the Obama campaign did. So, like, their voter file, like, they hit almost presidential turnout in 21, right? So to me, it's just, I guess the answer can't be, well, shit, we've had this problem for a long time and we're still going to have it. Like, how do we solve the problem?
To your question of like, who do we need to convince? Yeah. I think it needs to be a consensus among the national committees and the state parties. And unfortunately, we have created a situation where the state parties are so deprived of resources and assets that the only thing that they have to stand on is the data that they own. And they shouldn't give that up, because then it would kill the state party. What we need to do to fix this is we need to find ways to fund and support the state parties so that they will be comfortable giving up their control over their state voter files. So I think it unfortunately is a little bit of a long-term solution, but the long-term solution is finding a way to support the state parties in a way that if they lost to control over their state voter file, they don't crumble. They need to have resources so that they can give that up, because they don't have much else.
And also, another thing is, look, I used to be a Republican in my youth, and I remember voter vault, right? Like, the myth of Republican invincibility on data is sometimes it's very overstated, right? They were, voter vault was a thing in 2000, 2002, 2004, right? And then 2006, Dean's voter file team in-house changed everything, right? And suddenly now they're copying us. This thing goes back and forth. I think, I360 has its advantages, but it is also one central system. And if that whole thing goes down, they're all screwed, right?
We've talked a lot about on this panel kind of investing in tools and organizations that exist and not reinventing the wheel. Some of those tools are not accessible from an API perspective, or kind of a data in, data out. What is the answer for developers and campaigns that are trying to integrate with these tools?
So I have not followed Mobilize closely since the acquisition by Every Action, but I personally would hope that the private equity firm that owns Every Action, that owns Mobilize, would put some of their significant resources into improving the API.
Do you think they will?
No.
I think there are often cases to create competing tools if the tools that we have are not fulfilling their promise. What I don't like to see is when the organizations that have to end up building those tools are the ones that should be purchasing them. It shouldn't be the campaign. It shouldn't be the outreach organization. It shouldn't be a coordinator or a state party, because again, the people and the infrastructure and the money at all of those organizations is ephemeral. So I would say if Mobilize is not living up to expectations and another small company wants to come around and disrupt that, I would welcome that. What I think we sometimes run into, though, is we actually do have a number of tools that I think work very, very well. And then people come in and they say, like, I'd like to build some political tech. You know what? I'm going to build a texter. And I'm going to say, like, well, what problem are you solving that we don't already have solved by these 4 other tools? And they say, well, I'm really good at Twilio. And I'm like, that's not an important thing to bring to the table here. So to your point, I think if our tools start lagging, and we all use tools every day that have spent many years lagging, I think they do need to be disrupted, and they do need to be pushed out of the market or have competition so that they can make themselves better. But the entities that are trying to push against them cannot be the campaigns or the outreach organizations or the committees. It's just not feasible to happen there.
So Matt, one of the things you said earlier is that if you're building new technology, you should be able to explain in one sentence, how does this win me votes? How does this help the campaign? I think the corollary there might be if you're building some type of technology that already exists, you should be able to explain in one sentence why it's better, or like significantly better than the existing solutions out there.
I want to hear some comments on whether or not relational organizing and some of the technology-driven organizing has enabled us to be more inclusive of either the communities, people with disabilities, or different language barriers, or other maybe communities that aren't always organized as much.
Yeah, I think that this has definitely shown up during the time of the pandemic, for sure. At the Movement Cooperative, we work with a bunch of different progressive organizations. So we saw all these folks, talking to them. They had their plans for all of these in-person events, on the ground organizing, field plans, and then the pandemic hits. And all of a sudden, they have to switch everything to digital, and figuring out how to do that and how to move in-person events to virtual events, all of these things. And I think, at first there's felt like a lot of hindrance with that. It's like you couldn't have some of the connection right in person. But I think, to your point, what we're seeing out of that is a giving more thought to like communities, folks with disabilities, to make these things more accessible. And so having the hybrid model of like having in-person option, but also having things that can be virtual, folks being able and thinking about really being conscious and thinking about how folks can show up to the work, right? Like not everybody can go and stand at a protest, you know, but are there other things and other ways in which you can engage with folks who really want to be involved, that are accessible to them? And it's like maybe they join a Slack so they can join the texting program to do outreach themselves, or maybe that's like, you know, attending a virtual town hall where they're able to contribute, things like that. So I think, yes, absolutely that the pandemic I have seen organizations start to think about this more and how they're using tech, not only to get around, you know, COVID precautions, but reaching out to communities that were maybe left out before, for sure.
I can give an example from the Biden campaign here as well. So once everything became online during 2020, one of the things that the digital and communications team decided that was a high priority was anytime that Joe Biden would be speaking live on camera, there would also be a live ASL interpreter picture-in-picture with that. What's great about the way technology enabled that is, one, that ASL interpreter was not in the same location as Joe Biden. They were in a studio, listening to his words in real time and interpreting it in real time. So that's something like I don't think would have been built that way had we not kind of been thrust into this digital and tech first environment in 2020. Going forward on that, then the comms team came to us and said, can we use speech to text software to automate closed captions for when we upload this to YouTube? And our team said, we can absolutely do that. However, it's very flawed. And we need to keep a human in the loop to make sure that what we're putting out there for people to consume is still high quality and it's still meeting their needs to consume it. So what we did was we used speech to text software to create like the first draft of the closed captions. And then we were deliberate to have a human involved to then edit it. So it was all edited by a human. We did the exact same thing for multilingual captions, because this comes back to the idea that tech needs to be a force multiplier. And what we were doing here is we weren't removing a human from creating these accessibility pieces of our content, but we were making them more efficient. They weren't starting from nothing. They were starting from like what the software output, and then they were fixing it. So I think things like using Get Through or Hustle or other tools to reach people who otherwise wouldn't be picking up the phone is only a good thing. The problem becomes when we start behaving like what Josh has been talking about, where we just send these terrible text messages all the time, and like everyone just starts hating us. And like I don't like being. I've had to be on the phone with people and say like, I'm sorry, I don't send the text messages. I just built the tool that enables them to send the text messages, and that's not a great feeling.
Lauren, may I add one thought?
Yeah, you know, one thing.
There is one thing that I think is important, which is that organizing and power building are analog processes, right? And what I mean by that is they're not easily collapsible into neat buckets, right? And I think that a lot of times the things you're talking about, like say finding ASL workers to help things, become deprioritized because of donor imposed metrics. So in the same way, something like that Bush year bill encouraged teaching to the test, right? What happens is organizing starts happening to organizing to metrics, right? So instead of say finding ways to reach deaf people, right, which would be pretty important, we wind up doing things like I have to make 500 phone calls this week, otherwise I lose my funding. And I think this is a very dangerous part of like how organizing work gets quantified and digitized.
Well, thank you for that. I think we're about at the end of time, so just want to do sort of a quick wrap up. I want to thank everybody for being a really great audience today. I really appreciate our panel. We've talked a lot about kind of our technology today and how we can use it to enable us. Talked about how the goals we're kind of in this fight together is for technology to be a force multiplier, making sure we're enabling our organizers, not replacing folks on the ground, but supporting everybody, keeping in mind the cultural context, some ethical boundaries, and making sure that we're always using technology to increase the accessibility. So I hope you all have enjoyed this panel just as much as I have. I'm really excited to be in the fight with all of y'all for 2022 and beyond, and I hope y'all enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Thanks a lot.